The Helle Crafts case begins tonight in the quiet weight of a Connecticut winter file where you can almost feel the cool paper under your hand. There is no rush here, and we'll move through the evidence slowly, as if the whole room has lowered its voice. You turn the first page, and the date comes forward gently. The 18th of November, 1986, when Helle Crafts was expected to come home to Newtown after working a long flight as a Pan Am stewardess. The words are plain on the page, but the paper seems to hold more than ink, because you can sense the old office air around it, the faint smell of copier toner, the dry edge of a manila folder, and the soft scrape of a chair pulled closer to the desk. The Helle Crafts case would become known for strange evidence, patient work, and a kind of careful persistence that did not let small things remain small. You sit with her name for a moment, because names matter in old files. Helle had come from Denmark, built a life in Connecticut, raised children, traveled the world through work, and kept friendships with women who noticed when something felt wrong. In a cold case room or a trial record, a person can become a collection of dates and exhibits, but we won't let that happen here. We'll keep returning to the ordinary details, the house lights, the kitchen counters, the calls not returned, the friends who listened closely when Helle spoke about fear, divorce, and the future she was trying to arrange. The first strange thing, as you read, is not the famous evidence at all. It is the absence of a simple explanation. Helle did not simply drift out of her own life. Her friends did not believe that. Her employer did not believe that. The rhythm of her days had a shape, and when that shape changed suddenly, people close to her felt the missing edge of it, like a cup set down in the wrong place. You can imagine one of them standing near a phone, hearing only the quiet line, and feeling the room grow colder by a few degrees. At the center of the file is her husband, Richard Crafts, a pilot, a man with a practiced voice and a trained calm. He gave explanations that shifted and settled poorly. Helle was away, he suggested, or visiting family, or taking time for herself. Yet you and I, sitting with the later record, can see how investigators had to begin without the advantage of knowing what the case would become. They had no neat ending waiting for them. They had phone calls, statements, schedules, and the uneasy patience of people asking the same question again. The house in Newtown becomes one of the first rooms we enter quietly. You can picture winter light lying flat across the floor, children's things in their ordinary places, and the sort of domestic stillness that can make investigators lower their voices without meaning to. There were signs that someone had tried to clean. There were patterns that did not feel natural. But early investigation is rarely a single clear note. It is more often a low chord of mismatched details, and you have to let your ear adjust before you hear it. Helle's friends had already done a kind of detective work before the detectives fully understood the shape of the matter. They knew she had spoken of divorce. They knew she had concerns about her safety. One friend had been told that if anything happened to Helle, Richard should be looked at closely. That kind of statement sits heavily in a file, not because it solves anything by itself, but because it tells you where fear had already been living. You read it slowly, and you let the words rest without making them louder than they are. The private investigator, Keith Mayo, enters the case with his own kind of patience. Helle had hired him because she wanted information for a divorce, and that fact gives the early pages a quiet, practical texture. There are receipts, conversations, appointments, the ordinary machinery of someone preparing to change her life. You can almost hear the faint tap of office keys, the rustle of notes placed into a drawer, the muted ring of a telephone in another room. The work was not glamorous. It was careful, local, and human. When Helle disappeared, Mayo did not treat it as a passing misunderstanding. He had known enough to be concerned, and concern, in a case like this, can become a lantern. He pressed, called, gathered what he knew, and helped keep attention on the facts when easy explanations might have let the matter fade. You can feel that in the file, the way one person's refusal to accept a thin answer can keep a whole investigation from going to sleep too soon. Patient detective work often begins exactly there, with someone saying, softly but firmly, "This does not fit." But there was one more detail waiting near the edge of the early pages. and when we turn toward it, the Helle Crafts case begins to take on the strange shape for which it would later be remembered. The weather matters, as it so often does in old investigations. Connecticut, in late November, can feel gray and damp, with bare branches scratching softly at the sky and road shoulders holding the dark shine of recent rain. You imagine yourself driving through Newtown and Southbury in that season, your headlights moving across wet pavement, your breath warming the windshield as the heater hums low under the dashboard. It is not dramatic weather, it is working weather, the kind that presses quietly on everyone involved. After Helle vanished, investigators learned that Richard Crafts had rented a wood chipper. That single fact now feels almost impossible to separate from the case, but at the time it had to be treated as one fact among many. You cannot simply leap from a rental receipt to certainty. You have to walk there. You have to read the dates, speak with the rental company, note the model, consider where it might have gone, and ask who saw what along the roads. The paper trail had weight, but it needed witnesses to give it a path. A snowplow driver became one of those witnesses. His memory placed a wood chipper near Lake Zoar, along a road in Southbury, in the dim and practical world of late-night work. You can picture him inside the cab, high above the road, with engine vibration in his seat, wipers moving across the glass, and the pale sweep of headlights touching trees, shoulder gravel, and equipment in the dark. He was not looking for history, he was doing his job. Yet old cases often turn on people who notice something while doing ordinary work. You and I pause there, because this is where patient investigation feels most human. A person sees something, perhaps only for a few seconds. Arctic turns, days pass, the mind stores it without ceremony. Then, an investigator asks the right question in the right tone, and the memory is taken down, handled carefully, placed in the file. The evidence does not glow. It sits there, modest and specific, waiting for other facts to gather around it. In the Helle Crafts case, that sighting helped investigators imagine a route, a place, and a night. Lake Zoar itself has a quiet presence in the record. It is not only a name on a map. You can feel the cold water moving slowly beneath winter air, the banks holding leaves darkened by weather, the faint mineral smell of mud and river stones near the edge. Investigators searched there with care, not because they expected the search to be easy, but because the place had become part of the story. Every cold current, every patch of roadside brush, every small uneven place near the bank could matter. The searches were patient and physical. People walked, sifted, looked, and returned. You can imagine gloved hands, boots pressing into soft ground, the quiet clink of tools, and the tired focus of officers who knew that evidence might be small enough to miss in a careless hour. The work asked for humility. A large mystery had been reduced to fragments, fibers, metal, paper, and memory. That is one of the truths of investigation. Sometimes the largest question must be approached through the smallest material things. Among the pieces recovered were bits of material that would later be tested and compared. There were wood chips. There were strands and fragments. There were items that did not explain themselves when first seen. You sit with those details as an evidence technician might, under steady light, with the table cleared and each item marked. The smell of damp earth may still cling faintly to a bag. The label ink may be slightly uneven. The quiet discipline is the point. Nothing is rushed, and nothing is asked to mean more than it can bear. The wood chipper, when investigators examined it, became more than a rental record. It became a machine with surfaces, blades, seams, and trapped traces. You can imagine the metal cold to the touch, the residue caught in difficult corners, the careful process of taking samples, preserving them, and writing everything down. Forensic work can sound abstract when summarized later, but in the moment it is tactile and slow. Someone leans closer, someone changes gloves, someone marks a container, someone keeps the chain of custody intact. The phrase, "weird evidence," can make a case sound sharper than it should, but here we'll let it mean something quieter. It means evidence that did not look, at first, like the familiar proof of a courtroom story. It means tiny things rescued from mud, machinery, and water, It means material so small that its importance depended on trained attention. In the Helle Crafts case, the unusual evidence did not speak in one loud sentence. It spoke in a series of careful comparisons, each one adding its small weight. And as the next part of the file opens, we move from roads and riverbanks into the steady rooms where science tried to give those small traces a reliable voice. Inside the forensic laboratory, the Helle Crafts case becomes quieter in a different way, not less human, but more exacting, as if every breath in the room has to leave space for measurement. You can imagine the stainless work surfaces, the cool overhead light, the faint chemical smell of clean instruments, and the soft paper sound of evidence envelopes being opened one at a time. Nothing here is theatrical. It is the patient work of trained eyes, and we move with them slowly, because in this case, the strange evidence needed time before it could become meaning. Dr. Henry Lee and the Connecticut forensic team had to work with things that were small, damaged by weather, and separated from their original context. You sit beside the file, and you feel how difficult that is. A large story had been broken into tiny pieces, and each one had to be treated with respect. Investigators could not make the evidence larger by wanting it to be larger. They could only preserve it, study it, compare it, and ask what it could honestly tell them. The wood chips and recovered fragments were examined under magnification, where the world changes scale. You can picture a technician leaning close to a microscope, the rubber eyepieces cool against the skin, the field of view filling with textures invisible to the untrained eye. A speck becomes a landscape, a fiber becomes a line of color and twist, a fragment of bone, if that is what it is, must be distinguished carefully from other pale, brittle materials that might have come from the woods, the roadside, or the riverbank. That caution matters, and we should sit with it. In the Helle Crafts case, the unusual evidence did not simply announce itself as proof. It had to pass through method. It had to survive questions. It had to be collected in ways that a courtroom could later understand. You can almost hear the quiet scratch of a pen as notes were made, each observation tied to a bag number, a date, a location, and a person who handled it. The patience was part of the evidence. Some recovered material was identified as human bone. Even spoken gently, that fact carries weight, so we do not rush past it. We let it rest in the room with us, plainly and without detail beyond what is needed. The fragments were small, and they did not give investigators the fullness of a body or a final image. They gave them something more modest and more difficult, a scientific basis to say that this was no longer simply a disappearance. The file changed shape under that knowledge. You can feel how that would have affected everyone reading the case in real time. A missing person investigation leaves a narrow but living opening for return, mistake, distance, or chosen absence, even when those possibilities feel weak. But forensic identification can close some doors while opening harder ones. The Helle Crafts investigation moved from unanswered absence into the realm of homicide, and it did so not through a confession or a witness to the central event, but through fragments pulled from winter places and studied under steady light. The dental evidence was one of the most unusual parts of the case. A tooth or dental material, recovered among the small items, allowed specialists to compare what was found with records associated with Helle. You can imagine the paper dental chart, the careful marks, the old radiographs held up to light, and the restrained focus of someone trained to read identity in enamel, repair work, angles, and shape. A mouth leaves a private record behind, and sometimes that record speaks when almost nothing else can. We pause here because dental comparison is intimate in a way that is easy to overlook. It is not an abstract science only. It depends on a person's ordinary life, on appointments made years before, on a dentist's notes, on the quiet fact that Helle once sat in a chair under a bright lamp while someone recorded what was needed for her care. Years later, those records became part of the search for her. You feel the long thread between the ordinary appointment and the courtroom exhibit. The evidence did not stand alone. It leaned against other facts. There was the rental of the wood chipper. There was the snowplow driver's account. There were traces recovered near Lake Zoar. There were questions about the house, the cleaning, the freezer, the bedding, and the timing of Richard Crafts' explanations. You turn the pages slowly, and you begin to see how a case without one central piece can still gather strength, not by shouting, but by becoming harder and harder to explain away. The freezer detail sits strangely in the file, cold even on the page. Investigators found signs that a large freezer had been used or moved, and questions gathered around it. You do not need dramatic language to feel the unease of that domestic object becoming evidence. A freezer is usually a practical thing, humming softly in a basement or garage, holding food wrapped in paper and frost. In this file, it becomes a place investigators had to think about carefully, measuring stains, testing traces, and asking what ordinary use could or could not explain. You can imagine standing in that basement air, where concrete holds the chill and every sound seems smaller. The hum might be gone by the time investigators arrive, but the impression remains, the sense of a household object made suddenly important. Evidence technicians in such spaces have to be disciplined. They cannot let atmosphere do the work of proof. They look, photograph, swab, label, and keep going, because the case depends on what can be shown, not merely what can be felt. There were reported traces of blood in the home, including evidence that cleaning had taken place. Again, we keep the language calm. The meaning of a trace depends on where it is, how much there is, whether it matches a person, and whether there is an ordinary explanation. In the Helle Crafts case, investigators worked in an era before today's DNA testing had the reach and sensitivity we now expect. They had blood typing, microscopy, comparison, and the experienced judgment of forensic scientists working with tools that required patience. That older forensic world is worth remembering. You and I are used to modern stories where a tiny sample might produce a full genetic profile, but this case belonged to an earlier stage of science. The lab benches were real, the questions were real, but the answers came through narrower doors. Investigators had to build a case using serology, fiber comparison, tool evidence, witness memory, records, and pattern. They had to connect facts without the comfort of a single modern test carrying everything. The chainsaw evidence also became part of the file, another ordinary tool drawn into a very difficult question. Investigators examined it, as they examined the chipper, for traces that might help explain what had happened after Helle disappeared. You can picture the careful handling, the smell of metal and old oil, the slight tackiness of residue on a surface that has been bagged and stored. A tool in evidence is never just a tool. It is a question with edges, waiting for someone patient enough to inspect it. As we sit with this section, we should notice how much of the investigation depended on connecting domestic, mechanical, and natural spaces. A bedroom, a freezer, a rented machine, a roadside near water, a riverbank, a laboratory bench. The Helle Crafts case moved through all of them. You turn one page and hear the low indoor hum of a house. You turn another and feel the cold air along Lake Zoar. Then the next page brings you back to a fluorescent room where fragments are sorted under magnification. That movement gives the case its quiet strangeness. It is not strange because it is dramatic. It is strange because the evidence traveled through places where people do not expect evidence to be. Investigators had to think like practical people, asking how things are rented, moved, cleaned, discarded, observed, and remembered. They had to think about the weight of equipment, the timing of a road sighting, the condition of a riverbank, and the habits of a family home. Patient detective work is often practical before it is profound. Years later, when people remember the Helle Crafts case, they often remember the wood chipper first. But the case was not solved by one object alone, and as we keep reading, the smaller witnesses begin to matter just as much. The witness statements have their own texture, softer than lab reports, but no less important. You can feel the difference when the file shifts from measurements to voices. A statement carries hesitations, corrections, remembered weather, a time estimated from a work shift, and the plain human effort to be accurate about something seen days or weeks earlier. In the Helle Crafts case, those statements helped investigators place Richard Crafts and the rented equipment within a real geography, not just a theory drawn on paper. The snowplow driver's account is one we return to because it shows how ordinary work can brush against hidden history. He was out in the dark, doing a job that depends on roads, timing, salt, ice, and attention to surface. You can imagine the cab smelling faintly of diesel and damp clothing, with the windshield streaked by weather and the lights making every roadside object appear briefly, then pass away. Somewhere in that working night, he saw equipment that would later matter very much. When investigators spoke with him, they were not simply collecting a dramatic memory. They were trying to anchor time and place. Was it the right date? Was the machine in the right location? Did the description match the rented wood chipper? Could the sighting fit with the other known movements? You can feel the slow pressure of those questions, each one modest, each one necessary. A witness statement becomes useful only when it can bear the weight placed on it. There were also friends who remembered Helle's worries and her plans. Their memories were not mechanical evidence, but they gave the disappearance context. You can picture women sitting at kitchen tables, cups cooling beside them, speaking carefully to investigators about conversations they wished they had not needed to remember. Helle had spoken of divorce. She had tried to prepare. She had not sounded like someone planning to vanish voluntarily. These recollections gave the file its human contour, and we hold them gently. You and I should be careful with such memories. Fear remembered after an event can be difficult, because people naturally return to old conversations looking for warning signs. But investigators cannot dismiss them, especially when several details point the same way. In the Helle Crafts case, her friend's concerns helped challenge Richard's explanations. They kept Helle's own voice present in the file, not as rumor, but as remembered statements from people who knew her patterns and cared when those patterns broke. The children were part of the household story too. Though we treat that part with particular quiet, their lives had been disturbed in ways no child should have to understand. Investigators and later jurors had to consider what Richard told them, where they were, and what they may have noticed. But the central focus remained on adult actions and evidence. You can feel the tenderness required here. A case file can hold a family's private wreckage, and a careful reader does not press harder than needed. Richard's explanations shifted over time, and those shifts mattered. He suggested that Helle had gone away, perhaps to Denmark, perhaps somewhere else, but her friends and colleagues found that unlikely. Helle was connected to her children, to her work, to her plans, and to the legal steps she had begun. You can imagine investigators writing down each explanation, then comparing it to airline records, phone calls, family contact, and the ordinary traces a traveling person leaves behind. A false story often frays at the edges first. In these pages, we also see the value of timing. When was Helle last seen? When did Richard rent the wood chipper? When was the machine observed near Lake Zoar? When were items bought, moved, cleaned, or reported? You sit with a timeline as if it were a long piece of thread stretched across the desk. At first, it may tangle. Then, with patience, knots begin to separate. Dates become relationships, hours become opportunities. Gaps become questions that ask to be answered. The day after a disappearance can be full of small, revealing actions. Calls are made or not made. Alarms are raised or delayed. Plans are explained or rearranged. Investigators in the Helle Crafts case had to read conduct as carefully as physical evidence, knowing that behavior alone does not convict, but behavior can tell you where to look. You can feel the difficulty of that balance. Human beings are complicated. Grief looks different in different rooms, but some actions still require careful scrutiny. The private investigator Keith Mayo again becomes important here. Because Helle had already involved him before she vanished, he held information that connected her disappearance to her marital situation and her fears. You can picture his notes, practical and possibly hurried, with names, dates, license plates, appointments, and observations gathered for one purpose, then suddenly needed for another. His role reminds us that cases are sometimes saved by paperwork created before anyone knows a case exists. The file is already forming before the official file opens. Mayo's persistence helped bring law enforcement attention to the situation when Richard's explanations did not satisfy those who knew Helle. That persistence can feel quiet on the page, but it mattered. A person had to keep asking. A person had to refuse the comfortable answer. You and I, reading later, may see the path clearly, but at the time, it had to be made step by step, through calls, visits, statements, and the stubborn feeling that a woman's absence had been explained too easily. Across this part of the file, the Helle Crafts case becomes a study in how suspicion becomes investigation, and how investigation becomes proof only through patient corroboration. You cannot convict a person because friends are worried. You cannot convict because an explanation sounds wrong. You cannot convict because a machine was rented. Each fact needs neighbors. Each neighbor needs a date, a place, a document, or a witness. The case grows like a careful stack of papers, not a single page held up to the light. When the next box comes down from the shelf, we find the evidence that lived in fibers, colors, and small manufactured traces, the kind that can make a household object speak softly years after it was used. Fibers are humble evidence. You can barely feel one on your fingertip, yet under the right lens it can carry color, structure, and history. In the Helle Crafts case, fibers helped connect places and objects that might otherwise have remained separate. You imagine the lab bench again, with tweezers resting in a tray, glass slides lined neatly, and a technician breathing slowly to keep the smallest material from drifting. The work is delicate, and there is something almost meditative in the discipline it requires. Blue fibers became part of the discussion around this case, linked to items and locations investigators examined. A fiber comparison does not usually speak in absolutes, the way a fingerprint might. It says something gentler and narrower. This fiber is consistent with that material. This color and structure match in ways that matter. This trace could have come from a certain source. You sit with that careful language because it is important. Science is strongest when it refuses to overstate itself. That restraint may sound less satisfying than certainty. But in a courtroom, restraint can build trust. Jurors are asked to listen not only to what experts say, but to how precisely they say it. In the Helle Crafts case, unusual evidence had to be explained without turning it into myth. The fibers, fragments, tools, and traces each had a limited voice. Together, they formed a pattern. You can imagine a prosecutor placing them in order, not rushing, giving each item enough room to be understood. The wood chipper evidence required a similar patience. Investigators had to show that the machine had been rented, used, returned, and examined. They had to explain what was found in it and why those findings mattered. You can picture jurors looking at photographs, diagrams, and physical exhibits, trying to understand a machine most of them had probably seen only in landscaping work or municipal cleanup. The ordinary familiarity of the equipment may have made the evidence feel stranger, because ordinary objects are not expected to enter such solemn proceedings. There was also the question of how material from the chipper and the Lake Zoar area related to each other. If fragments and chips were recovered from a roadside or riverbank, investigators needed to account for the environment. Could other sources explain them? Were they collected properly? Did weather move them? Did water affect them? You and I can feel how many quiet questions sit beneath one courtroom sentence. The final testimony is only the visible surface of many patient hours. In old forensic cases, collection conditions can become just as important as the evidence itself. A defense attorney may ask who found an item, where it was found, how it was packaged, whether it could have been contaminated, and whether anyone assumed too much too soon. Those are fair questions in a serious case. The Helle Crafts investigation had to withstand them. That meant the scientists and officers had to explain not only what they believed, but how they got there, step by careful step. The fragments from the Lake Zoar area were not large, and that smallness shaped the entire case. You can imagine an evidence bag holding something so slight that it seems almost impossible for it to carry so much meaning. Yet the law often depends on such things. A fleck, a strand, a shard, a stain, a record, a receipt. They are small because real life leaves small traces. Detectives learn to notice them, and jurors learn, sometimes slowly, that small does not mean insignificant. There is a quiet lesson there for us as we sit beside the lamp with the file open. Patient investigation is a discipline of proportion. You do not make the small thing huge by imagination. You place it beside other small things until a shape appears. In the Helle Crafts case, the wood chipper rental beside the witness sighting, beside the recovered fragments, beside the dental comparison, beside the household, traces created a structure stronger than any one item could have been alone. You can almost hear the courtroom air when these items were described. Courtrooms have their own stillness, a mixture of polished wood, paper, wool coats, and low voices waiting for the next question. Evidence that was once wet, cold, and scattered near a riverbank becomes an exhibit on a table. A scientist who once leaned over a microscope now sits upright before jurors. The journey from roadside to testimony is long, and every part of it has to remain intact. But before the courtroom could weigh the evidence, investigators had to keep returning to the practical question of where Helle had gone, and whether Richard's account could survive the patient checking of ordinary records. Travel records mattered because Helle's life included travel. She worked as a flight attendant, and movement across distance was familiar to her. That familiarity made Richard's suggestions of travel sound possible on the surface, but only on the surface. You can imagine investigators checking airlines, family contacts, passport possibilities, phone records, and the quiet paper trails people leave when they truly go somewhere. A person may cross an ocean, but they usually leave ripples behind. In Helle's case, those expected ripples were missing. Her Danish family had not received the kind of contact one would expect if she had simply returned home. Friends did not hear from her in the ways they knew. Her employer did not see the pattern of a chosen absence. You sit with that absence, and it becomes less blank as you study it. It is not just that Helle was not seen. It is that the usual signs of her care, responsibility, and connection stopped in a way that did not match her life. The Helle Crafts case teaches us that disappearance is investigated through presence. Investigators look for the presence of a ticket, a call, a bank use, a witness, a hotel record, a family message, a workplace contact. When those presences do not appear, the absence gains definition. You can picture a detective drawing lines through possibilities, not dramatically, but with the weariness of someone who has checked and checked again. Each negative result is still work. Each closed avenue is still part of the map. Richard's use of explanations became another part of that map. If Helle was away, why were her contacts not hearing from her? If she had chosen distance, why had she left behind the obligations and relationships that defined her days? If she had gone to Denmark, why did the people there not confirm it? You can hear the questions spoken quietly in an interview room with a recorder running softly and a notepad open. No raised voice is needed. A timeline can press harder than volume. The domestic details returned again and again. Bedding had reportedly been replaced or removed. Cleaning had occurred. Items associated with Helle were handled in ways that raised concern. You and I do not need to turn these details into spectacle. We simply notice how investigators noticed them. A household has a memory of use. When that memory is altered suddenly, the alteration itself may become evidence. A missing bedspread, a cleaned surface, a changed arrangement can all ask a question. The bedroom, especially, would have been treated with care. You can imagine the soft drag of an evidence technician's shoes on carpet, the camera flash, the numbered markers, the quiet instructions exchanged between people who have done difficult work before. The room may have looked ordinary to an untrained eye, or nearly ordinary, but forensic attention is a different kind of seeing. It looks beneath tidiness. It asks why a stain remains here, why an item is absent there, why one surface looks newly disturbed. At the same time, investigators had to avoid making certainty out of atmosphere. A house can be messy. People clean for many reasons. Bedding wears out. Freezers move. Tools are rented for legitimate work. That is why the Helle Crafts case had to be built as a pattern, not a mood. You feel the discipline of that as you read. Every fact is asked to carry only its proper weight. then placed with others until the combined weight becomes difficult to move. The children's recollections, the friend's worries, Mayo's notes, and Richard's statements all met the physical evidence in that pattern. This is where patient detective work begins to feel almost architectural. One beam is not enough, one wall is not enough, but gradually, with records, testimony, forensic findings and timeline, a structure rises. You can sit back for a moment and see it forming, not suddenly, but the way dawn forms in a winter room, changing the edges before filling the space. Still, the prosecution faced a serious challenge. Helle's body had not been recovered in the ordinary sense. This was one of the reasons the case became so important in legal history. You and I can feel the weight of that challenge. A jury would have to consider whether the evidence proved not only that Helle was dead, but that Richard Crafts had caused her death and worked to hide it. The law required proof beyond a reasonable doubt, and the evidence had to meet that solemn standard. When we move toward the trial record, we enter another kind of patient room, where the strange evidence is translated for people who were not there when it was found. The first trial did not end with a conviction. It ended with a jury unable to agree, and that fact is important because it reminds us that difficult evidence remains difficult even after months of work. You can imagine the exhaustion in the courthouse corridors, the attorneys gathering files, the family members absorbing the delay, the investigators returning to the same evidence with the knowledge that it had not yet carried the day. There is no easy triumph in that moment. There is only more waiting. A hung jury can feel, from the outside, like a pause that says nothing. But inside, an investigation, it can sharpen every question. What was unclear? What needed better explanation? Which expert testimony needed a steadier path? Which timeline point needed more careful presentation? You and I sit with the prosecution team as they would have had to sit with the case again, not inventing new facts, but arranging the true ones so that their meaning could be followed. Patience again became the central tool. The second trial allowed the evidence to be presented anew. The same strange fragments, the same machine, the same road sighting, the same household traces, the same missing travel records, but now carried through a refined path. You can picture boxes being opened again, exhibits checked against lists, witnesses reviewing prior statements, and experts preparing to explain specialized findings in plain language. The paper smell returns. The fluorescent lights return. The whole case breathes again, slowly, because the law has asked it to speak once more. Forensic testimony in such a trial has to do a delicate thing. It has to teach without overwhelming. Jurors must understand what a bone fragment is, how it was identified, what dental comparison can show, what fiber analysis can and cannot prove, and why the wood chipper mattered. You can imagine them listening, perhaps tired by afternoon, perhaps taking notes, perhaps looking from a photograph to the witness and back again. The evidence does not become simpler, but it becomes more patiently explained. Dr. Henry Lee's role is often remembered because he helped interpret the physical evidence in a case that lacked conventional remains. His work did not replace the rest of the investigation. It joined it. You and I should notice that distinction. A famous forensic scientist can draw attention, but the case still depended on local officers, lab technicians, searchers, witnesses, friends, records clerks, rental employees, and many others whose names are less often spoken. Patient investigation is rarely the work of one person alone. The dental expert's testimony carried its own quiet force. Dental records are specific, and when a recovered item can be compared to a known person's dental history, identity begins to emerge from something very small. You can picture the charts laid out, the careful explanation of restorations or features, the jurors being asked to follow shape and correspondence rather than emotion. The human body, even in small evidence, can carry a record of care received over years. That record helped bring Helle's name back into the courtroom. There is something deeply human about that. Helle's identity was not recovered through spectacle, but through the traces of an ordinary life. Her dental care, her friendships, her work schedule, her children, her plans for divorce, her conversations, her belongings. The case did not restore what had been taken from her family, but it refused to let her vanish into Richard's explanations. You and I keep that in mind, because the center of the Helle Crafts case is not the machine, it is Helle. The defense challenged the evidence, as a defense must. Questions were raised about interpretation, contamination, the limits of the forensic findings, and the absence of a complete body. That process may feel uncomfortable, but it is part of the system's caution. A serious accusation has to be tested. You can hear the cross-examination in a low courtroom tone, the expert pausing before answering, the court reporter's keys moving steadily, the judge listening for the boundary between fair question and overreach. This is another place where the sleep of the story is not the sleep of indifference. We are calm, but we are attentive. You sit beside the record and feel how much care a just system is supposed to require. Evidence should not be accepted because it is unusual. It should be accepted because it is reliable. In the Helle Crafts case, the prosecution had to show that the weirdness of the evidence did not weaken it, but instead reflected the unusual way the truth had to be recovered. The wood chipper demonstration and related explanations helped jurors understand how small fragments could result from mechanical action without requiring us to dwell on anything graphic. The point was not shock. The point was possibility, consistency, and physical process. You can imagine a courtroom diagram, an expert explaining movement and material, the jurors connecting that explanation to the recovered traces and the rented machine. Calmly, methodically, the prosecution built a bridge from object to evidence, and from evidence to inference. The Lake Zoar search evidence then gave that bridge a place on the map. The road, the sighting, the recovered material, the cold outdoor conditions, and the timing all moved together. You can picture a large map being shown, with locations marked in a way jurors could follow. Roads that once held only headlights and winter trees became lines of testimony. The riverbank became more than scenery. It became a location where the file's strange fragments found their geography. Maps are helpful in cases like this because they give the mind a place to rest. You and I can feel that even now, a name like Lake Zoar becomes more grounded when we imagine the curves of the water, the road beside it, the slope down from pavement, the leaves gathered in wet patches near the bank. Evidence needs place. Without place, it floats. With place, it becomes part of a sequence, and a sequence can be tested. The jury also heard about Helle's life before the disappearance, because motive and context had to be understood. The marriage was troubled. Divorce was approaching. Helle had taken steps to protect herself, legally and practically. You can picture her gathering documents, speaking with friends, making plans in the careful way people do when they are trying to change a life without making it collapse. Those details are not gossip. They explain why her sudden absence did not make sense as a voluntary departure. Richard Crafts, in contrast, was presented through actions that suggested concealment. His statements, the rental, the cleaning, the movement of items, and the handling of explanations all became part of the prosecution's argument. You can sit with that without raising your voice. The file itself does the work. It places one action after another and asks whether an innocent explanation can still hold them all. In patient detective work, the strongest questions are often the simplest ones repeated over time. What happened after the trial began to turn on whether jurors could accept a case made from fragments. Not fragments of argument, but fragments of material reality. A bone piece, a dental comparison, fibers, blood evidence, tool evidence, witness memory, receipts, behavior, absence. You can imagine the deliberation room with its long table, water cups, legal pads, and the tired quiet of people asked to decide something irreversible. The evidence went in with them, and the question waited there. The second jury convicted Richard Crafts of murder. The words are stark, but we say them softly, because a conviction in a case like this is not a celebration. It is a legal finding after a long, difficult road. For Helle's loved ones, it may have brought recognition, but not restoration. For investigators, it may have confirmed the patient work, but not erased the nights spent searching or the uncertainty endured. You and I let the fact stand. without making it louder than it needs to be. The case became known as one of the first in Connecticut, where a murder conviction was obtained without a recovered body in the traditional sense. That legal history matters, though the phrase can sound too neat. The body was not absent from the case entirely. Traces were found, studied, and identified. What was absent was the complete form that courts and families often expect. The law had to consider whether small, scientifically understood evidence could answer the large question of death and responsibility. In the Helle Crafts case, it could, but it did so only because the evidence had been gathered patiently, because witnesses had been heard, because scientists had been careful, and because the prosecution learned how to explain the strange material without turning away from its limitations. You can feel the long labor underneath that outcome. It was not a single brilliant moment. It was a file built page by page, through weather, doubt, storage rooms, testimony, and repeated review. But even after conviction, a case file does not become silent, because the people inside it remain human, and the evidence still asks us to consider how much patience the truth required. Richard Crafts was sentenced to a long prison term, and the legal record moved forward into appeals, reports, and public memory. Yet for those who knew Helle, the formal sentence could not replace her presence. You can imagine the family's experience as something quieter and more complicated than any headline. A courtroom answer may settle responsibility, but it does not bring back the daily voice, the familiar step in the hall, the remembered perfume, the ordinary warmth of a person walking into a room. That is why we keep returning to Helle herself. She was not an exhibit. She was a woman with children, friends, colleagues, habits, fears, hopes, and plans. She moved through airports, carried luggage, worked long flights, and crossed time zones with professional grace. You can hear, faintly, the public address system in an airport terminal, the rolling sound of suitcase wheels, the low murmur of passengers waiting to board. That was part of her world before the file narrowed around her name. Pan Am itself gives the story a time and texture. The airline belonged to an era of travel that now feels almost archived, with uniforms, routes, and international glamour softened by memory. Helle's work connected her to a larger world than the quiet Connecticut town where she lived. You can imagine her returning from a flight tired but composed, stepping from the work of service and movement back into domestic concerns. The contrast between those worlds gives her disappearance an added ache. Her friends understood that contrast. They saw the capable public person and the private strain she carried. They listened when she spoke of Richard, divorce, and concern. Their later testimony came from friendship, but friendship can be a reliable form of noticing. You and I know this from ordinary life. The people close to us notice when our voice changes, when our plans shift, when our silence is not like us. In this case, that noticing became part of the investigation. The file preserves some of that care in formal language, but you can feel the feeling underneath. A friend calls because she has not heard back. Another remembers a warning. Someone contacts Keith Mayo. Someone tells investigators what Helle had said. Each action is small, but together they resist disappearance. They say, in effect, she was here, she mattered, and this explanation is not enough. In cold or difficult cases, that insistence can keep a name from being folded away too soon. Evidence rooms hold that same kind of insistence in physical form. You can imagine a cardboard box on a metal shelf, labeled with case numbers, the corners softening over years, the tape yellowing slightly, the contents quiet, but not forgotten. The Helle Crafts case did not depend on decades of storage before resolution, but it still carries the feeling of evidence waiting to be understood. Items had to sit in bags, in labs, in courtrooms, and in memory until their combined meaning could be seen. The strange evidence also changed how people thought about nobody prosecutions. It showed that a person does not have to be recovered whole for the law to recognize what happened. That is a grave idea, and we handle it carefully. It places great responsibility on investigators and scientists. They must be accurate. They must be honest about limits. They must give courts enough to distinguish proof from speculation. In the Helle Crafts case, the small physical traces had to carry that responsibility. You can feel how much trust that required from the jury. They were asked to accept expert testimony about material most people never examine. They had to understand why certain fragments were human, why dental comparison mattered, why fibers could be significant, and why the equipment and timeline supported the prosecution's account. Jurors are ordinary people asked to do extraordinary listening. In a difficult case, their patience becomes part of the justice process too. The case also reminds us that technology is only as useful as the questions people ask. A microscope alone does not solve a case. A lab alone does not solve a case. A witness alone does not solve a case. You need someone to connect the rental receipt to the machine to the road to the search to the fragments to the lab, and the lab to the person whose name began the file. That connecting work is the quiet heart of investigation. When you read the Helle Crafts case slowly, you begin to notice how often people simply did their jobs well. A rental employee kept or provided records. A snowplow driver remembered. Searchers looked closely. Scientists tested carefully. Friends spoke up. Attorneys prepared. Jurors listened. None of that removes the sorrow of the case, but it shows the human patience that gathered around Helle's absence. The file is heavy because of what happened, but it is also held together by care. And as we turn another page, the care becomes visible in the way investigators reconstructed a timeline from the ordinary marks of daily life. The timeline after the 18th of November carries a subdued, practical rhythm. Helle had returned from a flight, and then the familiar signs of her life began to disappear from view. You sit with the calendar and trace the days with your eyes, noticing how quickly concern can gather when a reliable person becomes unreachable. A missed call may seem small. A second missed call feels different. By the time several people are uneasy, the absence has developed its own weather. Richard's statements tried to give the absence a story, but the story kept rubbing against known facts. You can imagine an investigator with a notepad drawing a line down the page, one side for what Richard said, the other for what records and witnesses showed. This is not glamorous work. It is comparison. It is patient contradiction. It is the slow discovery that one version of events does not sit flat against another. The file grows by these quiet misalignments. The rental of the wood chipper had its own dates and documents. Machines are rented through practical systems with forms, signatures, times, fees, and returns. You can picture the counter at the rental business, the smell of rubber tires and machine oil, the clipboard handled by several hands, the faint carbon copy impression on paper. Ordinary commerce created a record. That record did not know it would matter. It simply waited until investigators asked the right question. The machine itself had physical characteristics that witnesses and experts could discuss. Its size, transport, operation, and return all became relevant. You can imagine investigators asking how it would be moved, what vehicle might tow it, where it could be used, and what noise or debris it might produce. Such questions are grounded in the real world. They depend on weight, roads, fuel, weather, and visibility. Patient detective work often sounds like common sense, repeated until it becomes evidence. The Lake Zoar search area then became tied to that practical world. If a machine had been seen there, investigators had to understand the location as workers and drivers would. Where could a vehicle pull off? What could be seen from the road? What would be hidden by darkness or trees? What might wash downward with rain? You can feel the cold dampness in that thinking, the way a map becomes a place only when someone has stood there and looked. Searches near water ask for special patience. Water moves things, hides things, changes edges, and makes evidence fragile. Mud can hold a trace or swallow it. Leaves can cover something small in an hour. A roadside can be disturbed by weather, traffic, animals, and cleanup. You and I, sitting comfortably with the file, should remember the physical difficulty of that work. It is not simply a search. It is bending, sifting, marking, bagging, and returning when the light changes. Investigators recovered many small items from that environment, including wood chips and biological fragments later examined in the lab. Each item had to be collected with location information. Each one had to be preserved. You can hear the soft snap of evidence bags, the murmur of officers confirming labels, the scrape of boots near wet leaves. The scene would not have offered easy answers. It would have offered only small possibilities, and the people there had to treat those possibilities as worth the strain. Back at the lab, the comparison work continued. Materials from the search area could be compared to materials from the chipper or other sources. Fibers could be compared to household items. Biological traces could be tested according to the methods available then. You can imagine the file expanding with reports, each written in careful language, each adding another measured observation. No single report had to be poetic. Its strength came from precision, from saying exactly what had been found and what could be concluded. This is where the Helle Crafts case becomes almost a lesson in patience itself. We often want a mystery to turn on one clean clue, a single note hidden in a drawer, one unmistakable print on glass. But real investigation is usually less graceful and more durable. It asks people to tolerate uncertainty while working anyway. It asks them to collect what may later prove unimportant. It asks them not to know too soon, and not to stop because knowing is hard. You can feel that patience in the way the case was prepared for trial after trial. The first jury's inability to agree did not erase the work. It sent everyone back into the evidence with new attention. That must have been difficult. Imagine the same boxes reopened, the same photographs reviewed, the same witnesses contacted again, the same grief stirred by procedure, yet the work continued. In old case files, persistence often looks like returning to the same page until the page finally gives up what it can. But there was still the matter of how to explain a case built from fragments to people who had not lived inside it, and that task required a calm, almost teacherly form of storytelling. A courtroom story has to be orderly, but life rarely is. The prosecution had to take scattered things and arrange them so jurors could follow the movement from Helle's last known days to Richard's actions, the rented machine, the search area, the laboratory findings, and the conclusion they believed the evidence supported. You can picture the attorneys deciding what to show first, what to explain slowly, and where a witness's memory should meet a document. The arrangement mattered because attention is human. Jurors needed to understand Helle before they could fully understand her absence. They needed to know she was not a person likely to abandon her children, work, friends, and future without leaving real signs. They needed to hear about the divorce context without losing sight of her dignity. You and I can feel the care required there. A person's private life enters court only because the case demands it, and even then, it should be handled as something lived, not something displayed. They also needed to understand Richard's knowledge and opportunity. As her husband, he had access to the house, the household items, the children's routines, and the ability to offer explanations to people asking questions. The prosecution's case placed that access beside his actions after Helle vanished. You can imagine jurors slowly building their own internal timeline, placing each fact where it belonged, then testing whether the defense explanation could still make sense. The quiet work of judgment happens inside each listener. The strange physical evidence, then, came not as an isolated shock, but as part of that larger structure. A machine had been rented. A similar machine had been seen near water. Fragments were found in that area. Some were identified in ways that connected to Helle. Traces in the home and on tools added context. Statements and records narrowed the possibilities. You can feel the cumulative force of the case, not like a door slamming, but like snow gathering on a branch until the branch must bend. The defense's task was to keep doubt alive. That meant pointing to the smallness of the fragments, the difficulty of identification, the possibility of contamination, and the absence of a complete body. It meant challenging witness memory and expert interpretation. You can hear those questions in the courtroom, measured and persistent. A fair trial requires that pressure. Evidence becomes stronger when it can endure questions asked directly, under oath, with the record keeping every word. Expert witnesses had to remain calm under that pressure. You can imagine a scientist listening to a long question, pausing, then answering only what the science allowed. Perhaps the courtroom was warm by afternoon. Perhaps papers shifted at counsel tables. Perhaps someone coughed softly near the back. The human details matter because science in court is spoken by people, received by people, and judged by people. It does not float above the room. It has to live there. The juror's patience was tested by technical material, bone identification, dental comparison, tool evidence, and fiber analysis require attention. Yet the evidence was not beyond ordinary understanding when explained carefully. A fragment can be examined. A dental record can be compared. A fiber can be matched in characteristics. A rental record can be read. A witness can describe what he saw. You and I can sense how the case became accessible through slow explanation, one ordinary step at a time. That may be why the Helle Crafts case remains so often discussed in forensic history. It is not only because the evidence was unusual, it is because unusual evidence was made understandable without losing its seriousness. The courtroom had to learn how small things, properly collected and interpreted, could answer a large question. The case became a marker for what forensic patience could do, especially when a person had tried to make proof difficult to find. Still, we should not let the forensic achievement crowd out the sorrow beneath it. Every clever comparison, every recovered fragment, every expert report existed because Helle was gone. The science mattered because a life mattered first. You sit with that distinction gently. The evidence solved a legal question, but it did not make the loss orderly. It only gave the loss a name, a cause in law, and a person held responsible. That is something, but it is not everything. The next pages let us return, for a while, to the investigators themselves, because their patience is part of why the strange evidence could ever become proof. Detectives in a case like this have to live with uncertainty in a very practical way. They drive to locations that may yield nothing. They knock on doors where memories may be thin. They request records that may arrive late or incomplete. They stand in cold places and ask whether a small item near their boot could matter. You can imagine the smell of coffee in a paper cup, the weight of a coat damp from weather, and the dull ache of looking too long at difficult ground. The Helle Crafts investigation required that kind of stamina. It was not a matter of finding one obvious scene and closing the file. It required movement between Newtown, Southbury, Lake Zoar, forensic labs, rental records, family interviews, and court preparation. Each place held a different kind of evidence. Each demanded a different skill. You and I can follow the path slowly, noticing how the investigation widened, then narrowed, then widened again, like someone breathing through a hard task. Some investigators had to search physically, others had to interview, others had to coordinate with forensic specialists, others had to think ahead to court, where every collection decision might later be questioned. A case file can make that look neat, because reports are placed in order after the fact. But during the work, people likely moved through uncertainty, fatigue, and repetition. The neat file is the final arrangement of many untidy days. There is a humility in that. Detectives do not know which witness will matter most when they begin. They do not know whether a receipt will become central. They do not know whether a tiny fragment will survive testing. They have to preserve possibilities before they understand them. You can feel that humility in the Helle Crafts case, because so much depended on not dismissing the odd, the small, or the inconvenient. The case asked investigators to keep looking even when the evidence resisted simplicity. The weather and season worked against them. Late autumn and early winter can age a search scene quickly. Leaves fall, rain spreads material, cold changes surfaces, and daylight ends early. You can picture the grey afternoon lowering over the trees near Lake Zoar, the air smelling of damp bark and river water, the ground giving slightly under each step. Searching there would have been slow, and the people doing it had to believe that slowness was not wasted. That belief is one of the quietest forms of professionalism. It means treating a ditch, a roadside, a machine surface, or a carpet fiber as worthy of attention before anyone knows whether it will help. It means writing down what seems boring because boring things later become decisive. In the Helle Crafts case, the decisive things were not grand. They were found through attention to practical details, the kind that often disappear when a story is retold too quickly. You and I can hold that as we continue. A cold or difficult case does not need to be made sharper to be meaningful. Its meaning is already there, in the patient work of people trying to answer a family's question. What happened to Helle? Where did she go? Why did the explanations fail? What could the evidence prove? These questions were asked in offices, labs, cars, courtrooms, and quiet kitchens, and they were answered only after many people did their part. The family's waiting ran alongside all of it. Legal timelines do not match emotional timelines. An arrest, a trial, a mistrial, a retrial, a conviction, an appeal. Each has dates and procedures, but grief moves differently. You can imagine loved ones hearing testimony that was necessary but painful, waiting through delays, and trying to live ordinary days while the case remained public. The file may be orderly, but the human experience around it was not so easily arranged. That is why the tone of the case should remain gentle. The evidence is strange, yes, and historically important. But the people were real. Helle's children had to grow up with the shadow of what happened. Her friends had to carry memories of conversations they could not change. Investigators had to keep returning to difficult material. Even Richard Crafts, convicted by the court, exists in the record as a human being who made choices with lasting consequences. Compassion does not erase responsibility. It keeps our voice honest. As we turn toward the later understanding of the case, the file begins to show how patient evidence can outlast the person who tried to hide it. The attempt to conceal a crime often creates new evidence. That is one of the quiet ironies investigators learn over time. Cleaning can leave cleaning patterns. Disposal can create travel records. A rented machine creates paperwork. A false explanation creates contradictions. A moved object leaves someone remembering it was moved. You can feel this principle running beneath the Helle Crafts case, not as a dramatic twist, but as a practical truth. Actions taken in secrecy still touch the world. Richard's alleged effort to remove or destroy evidence drew him into systems he could not fully control. Rental forms existed. Roads had workers on them. Machines held traces. Riverbanks could be searched. Friends had memories. Scientists had microscopes. The world, in its ordinary way, kept records. You and I can sit with that thought quietly. The ordinary world can be a witness, if someone is patient enough to ask it questions. A wood chipper is designed to reduce branches, not to carry a legal story. Yet in this case, its surfaces, residue, rental history, and observed location became part of the record. You can imagine the machine, returned after use, perhaps looking like any other piece of rented equipment to a casual glance. But investigators did not give it only a casual glance. They treated it as a possible witness made of metal, with seams and edges where tiny traces might remain. The same was true of the household spaces. A room can look cleaned. A surface can look ordinary. But forensic testing asks whether ordinary appearance is telling the whole truth. You can picture the quiet use of reagents, swabs, light, and careful observation. In the 1980s, these methods did not have the full power of later DNA technology, but they still allowed trained people to find what the eye might miss. The house, like the machine, had to be asked patiently. The Riverbank, too, held its record in a rougher language. It did not preserve evidence neatly. It mixed things with leaves, soil, water, and weather. Investigators had to sort through that natural confusion. You can feel the difference between lab order and outdoor search, between a labeled tray and a muddy slope. Yet both settings belonged to the same investigation. Truth did not stay in one room. It had to be followed across surfaces, systems, and seasons. When we think of weird evidence, we might be tempted to focus only on the unusual object, the wood chipper, because it is so memorable. But the deeper strangeness is that the case was solved through the cooperation of many ordinary things. A rental form, a snowplow route, a dental chart, a friend's memory, a lab report, a fiber, a map. Each thing was ordinary until the investigation placed it beside the others. Then the ordinary things began to reveal an extraordinary pattern. That pattern did not erase uncertainty all at once. Investigators still had to decide which leads were worth following and which explanations could be excluded. They had to accept that some details would remain incomplete. No case file contains everything. There are always hours no one saw, thoughts no one recorded, words no one can recover exactly. Patient investigation does not require total knowledge. It requires enough reliable knowledge to answer the legal and human questions before it. In the Helle Crafts case, enough reliable knowledge eventually gathered. That is what the conviction means in legal terms. But as we sit with the story for sleep, we are not here only for the legal endpoint. We are here for the slow human process, the way people held on to details, the way science listened to fragments, the way a woman's absence was refused as an easy disappearance. You can let that rhythm settle, like pages being turned in a quiet archive. There is still more in the file to consider, especially the way this case lived afterward in forensic classrooms, legal discussions, and the memory of people who study patient detective work. Forensic students have often encountered the Helle Crafts case because it teaches several lessons at once. It teaches that a body is not always recovered in a familiar form. It teaches that trace evidence can matter deeply. It teaches that timelines and witness accounts must support scientific findings. It teaches that juries need careful explanation. You can imagine a classroom years later, with a professor speaking softly over slides, students taking notes, and Helle's name appearing once again as part of a lesson in diligence. There is a risk in that educational afterlife, and we should notice it. When a case becomes a lesson, the person at its center can become a teaching example. That is why our voice keeps returning to Helle by name. The science is important because it served her case. The legal history is important because it recognized her death and held Richard accountable. But the human being remains first. You and I can keep that order clear, even while studying the evidence closely. The case also shows how forensic reputation is built. Dr. Henry Lee's involvement became part of his public profile, and the case became part of the larger story of forensic science entering public awareness. But behind every recognized expert are technicians, officers, and support staff whose careful handling makes expert interpretation possible. A fragment mislabeled, a bag poorly sealed, a note forgotten, and the whole chain can weaken. The quiet hands matter as much as the famous name. In laboratories, the work may have continued late into evenings, under lights that make time feel suspended. You can picture the polished counter reflecting a small circle of brightness, the faint squeak of a stool, the smell of latex or powder from gloves, and the dry rasp of an evidence envelope opened along its seam. A technician may not know whether the sample will matter. Still, the process is followed. That is the ethic. You do the careful thing before you know whether history will notice. The legal system noticed because the case tested assumptions. For many people, murder without a body seemed difficult to prove, and rightly so, because the consequences of conviction are enormous. Yet, the Helle Crafts case showed that absence of a complete body does not mean absence of proof. It showed that circumstantial and forensic evidence, when strong and interlocking, can meet the burden. The idea is sober, not sensational. It asks for caution, and it rewards careful work. Circumstantial evidence is sometimes misunderstood. People may think it is weak because it is indirect, but that is not always true. A footprint in snow is circumstantial. A bank record is circumstantial. A rental receipt is circumstantial. A witness seeing a machine near a river is circumstantial. A bank record is circumstantial. A rental receipt is circumstantial. A witness seeing a machine near a river is circumstantial. You and I can see how such evidence, when truthful and connected, can become very strong. The Helle Crafts case is almost a quiet meditation on that principle. Direct evidence says, "I saw this happen." Circumstantial evidence says, "These facts point to what happened." In many cases, direct evidence is unavailable, and investigators must rely on the patient gathering of circumstances. Each circumstance is tested. Each is placed carefully. The final picture does not come from imagination. It comes from the accumulation of reliable facts. In this case, the accumulation was unusual, but the method was traditional. Look, record, compare, test, and explain. The evidence also depended on time in another way. Some facts mattered because of sequence. Helle's last known contact came before Richard's suspicious actions. The rental came within the relevant period. The sighting near Lake Zoar fit the equipment and timing. The search produced material consistent with the prosecution's theory. The lab findings gave identity and biological meaning. You can trace that sequence gently with your finger on the page, letting each point find its place. Sequence is soothing to read, even when the subject is sad, because it gives the mind a path. First, the concern, then the questions, then the rental record, then the witness, then the search, then the lab, then the trial. Not because life happened so neatly, but because patient review can arrange the facts in a way that lets us understand them. You and I are doing that now, not to force closure, but to follow the evidence as carefully as it allows. As the file moves onward, another quiet theme appears. How much truth depends on people remembering ordinary things. A snowplow driver remembers equipment near a road. Friends remember conversations. Rental workers remember forms or provide records. Investigators remember to ask about machines, routes, and disposal. Scientists remember prior cases and methods. Jurors remember testimony long enough to compare it during deliberation. You can feel the human chain there, each link ordinary and imperfect, but together strong enough to hold meaning. The Helle Crafts case depended not on perfect memory, but on corroborated memory. Memory alone can be fragile, and good investigators know that. A witness may mistake a date. Weather can blur nights together. A machine glimpsed in darkness may be misdescribed. That is why the snowplow sighting mattered most when placed beside the rental record and the search evidence. You and I should appreciate that care. The case did not ask one man's memory to carry everything. It asked whether his memory fit with other facts, and that fitting gave it strength. Friends' memories worked the same way. One recollection of fear might be treated cautiously. Several recollections, placed beside Helle's concrete steps toward divorce and her hiring of Keith Mayo, carried more weight. The investigation listened to the emotional truth of friendship while still seeking practical confirmation. You can picture the interviews, the tissues on a table, the investigator's pen moving slowly, the witness stopping to find the right words. Human memory entered the file in careful, limited ways. Records, by contrast, have a colder feel. Rental documents, airline records, court papers, and lab reports do not tremble when read. They carry dates and signatures. But records are human too, because someone created them in ordinary time. You can imagine a clerk filing a form without knowing its future, a dentist marking a chart, a lab worker initialing a seal. The Helle Crafts case shows how ordinary record-keeping can become a form of delayed witness, speaking only when called. There is comfort, perhaps, in the idea that the world keeps more traces than people realize. Not perfect traces, not enough to answer every sorrow, but enough sometimes to challenge a false story. A road has workers, a machine has residue, a household has surfaces, a person has friends, a dentist has records. You and I can let that thought settle softly, because it is not a promise, but it is a reason investigators keep looking. The work of looking did not end with discovery. It had to be translated into language. Reports had to be written. Warrants or legal steps had to be supported. Prosecutors had to understand the science well enough to present it. Experts had to make technical findings clear without making them simplistic. You can hear the quiet labor of preparation. Pages arranged in binders, exhibit lists checked, phone calls made, testimony rehearsed only in the sense of clarifying truth. That preparation is often invisible in the public memory of a case. People remember the unusual evidence, the conviction, the headline. They forget the long hours spent making sure a label matches a report, a date matches a statement, and a photograph matches a location. But those hours are where justice is protected. In the Helle Crafts case, as in many difficult cases, the patient administrative work was not separate from the detective work. It was the detective work continuing in another form. You can imagine a prosecutor late at night with the file open. the office quiet except for ventilation and distant traffic, reading the same forensic report again to understand how to ask the question properly. The paper may smell faintly of ink and dust. A yellow legal pad may hold an outline that changes several times. This is not dramatic, but it matters. A good question in court can make months of evidence understandable. A poor question can leave meaning clouded. The courtroom then becomes the final archive where all the earlier archives meet. The house comes in through photographs. The road comes in through testimony. The riverbank comes in through collected exhibits. The lab comes in through reports and experts. Helle's life comes in through friends, records, and memory. Richard's actions come in through documents and witnesses. You and I sit at the back of that imagined room, listening as the scattered parts are brought into one long, careful account. And still, even there, the account is not the same as the life. That is why the tone remains low. A trial can establish facts, but it cannot contain a person. Helle was more than the last days of her life, more than the evidence that proved what happened, more than the case name repeated in forensic books. When we say the Helle Crafts case, we use a necessary shorthand, but behind it is Helle Crafts herself, and we keep the distinction alive. The file now begins to widen into the aftermath, not as an ending, but as the quieter space where cases continue to be remembered, studied, and carried by those who learned from them. After the conviction, the Helle Crafts case remained in public memory because of its unusual proof. Newspapers, legal commentators, forensic teachers, and true crime writers returned to it. Each return emphasized something slightly different. Some focused on the wood chipper, some focused on Henry Lee, some focused on the nobody prosecution, some focused on the friends who knew Helle would not simply leave. You and I, in this karma telling, try to hold all of those parts without letting any single one swallow the rest. Public memory can flatten a case into a phrase. The wood chipper case is memorable, but it is also incomplete. It risks turning patient investigation into a single shocking object. We can do better than that. We can say that the Helle Crafts case involved a rented wood chipper, yes, but also dental records, trace evidence, witness observation, domestic context, search work, legal persistence, and the loyalty of friends. The truth was not in one object, it was in the pattern. That pattern is why the case still teaches. It shows detectives to take strange details seriously without becoming captured by them. It shows forensic scientists to speak carefully, especially when evidence is small. It shows prosecutors to build bridges between technical findings and ordinary understanding. It shows jurors that proof can arrive quietly through accumulation. And it shows all of us that a missing person's life should be studied through care, not assumption. You can feel the archive air again as we sit with that. The box is not new anymore. The labels may have faded slightly. The case has moved from active investigation to legal history, from legal history to forensic instruction, from instruction to memory. Yet each time the file is opened, Helle's name is spoken. That matters. In old cases, being remembered accurately is a form of respect, especially when the facts are difficult and the public shorthand is too sharp. The strange evidence solved the legal case, but the patient work gave it dignity. Without careful witnesses, the evidence might have remained odd. Without lab discipline, it might have remained confusing. Without courtroom clarity, it might have remained disputed beyond use. Without friends and family refusing easy explanations, the investigation might have begun too slowly or drifted too soon. You and I can see how many forms of attention had to meet before the truth could hold. There is a softness in that kind of attention. Even when the subject is grave, it is the softness of people not giving up. The softness of a note kept, a call made, a sample preserved, a question asked again. The softness of science doing its work without grandstanding. The softness of a jury listening through technical difficulty. The Helle Crafts case is remembered for machinery. But beneath that memory is something much quieter. People giving their attention to a woman who could no longer ask for it herself. And as we keep moving through the file, slowly and without hurry, we return once more to the small pieces, because they are the reason this case could be brought out of uncertainty and into the light of a courtroom. The small pieces ask us to slow down because the Helle Crafts case did not become clear by looking at them once and deciding they were important. You can imagine the evidence spread across a clean surface, each item separated from the others, each label checked against a report, each report checked against the place where the item was found. There is a quiet humility in that process. A fragment does not explain itself. It waits for the trained eye, the careful comparison, and the patience to ask only what can truly be asked. Some of the recovered material from the Lake Zoar area had to be sorted from the ordinary matter of a winter roadside. Wood chips, soil, leaves, grit, and natural debris can all gather together in a way that makes everything look equally unremarkable at first. You can feel the cold dampness that would have clung to those samples, even after they were placed in bags and carried away. The work required a kind of calm refusal to be discouraged. One small item could matter, and so each small item deserved its moment. In the laboratory, magnification changed the scale of the search. A technician looking through a lens might see porous structure, surface marks, color, or texture that the unaided eye could miss. You and I can picture the round field of light under a microscope, bright at the center, fading slightly at the edges, while the rest of the room becomes quiet and secondary. That small circle of vision became a place where the investigation continued, not with footsteps along a riverbank, but with glass, light, and steady hands. When bone fragments were identified, the case moved deeper into science. Bone has structure, it has patterns and density. It can be distinguished from wood, plastic, stone, or other pale material by someone trained to see those differences. We do not need to linger on anything graphic to understand the importance. The identification told investigators that they were not merely dealing with suspicious behavior or a missing person's unexplained absence. They were dealing with physical evidence that belonged to the human body. You pause with that fact because it is the kind of fact that changes the air in a room. It does not solve everything by itself. It does not say who caused the death or how every moment unfolded, but it gives the investigation firmer ground. It tells the detectives that the absence has become something the law can name more clearly. In the Helle Crafts case, that mattered because so much else had been made uncertain, and uncertainty can be a shelter for false explanations. The dental material mattered in a different but related way. Where bone could help show human origin, dental comparison could help speak to identity. You can imagine dental records retrieved from a file cabinet, perhaps with the dry smell of old folders and the slight crackle of radiographs handled carefully. A person's dental history is private and ordinary while they are alive. Later, in rare and solemn circumstances, it can become a way of saying, with care, this trace is connected to this person. That connection brought Helle's name back to the smallest evidence. It kept the investigation from drifting into abstraction. The fragments near Lake Zoar were not just material. They were part of a case about Helle Crafts, a woman with a life full of movement, work, family, friendships, and plans. You and I return to that again because it steadies the telling. The evidence is strange, but the purpose of the evidence is simple. It is to answer what happened to Helle, and to do so truthfully. The woodchipper's role in that answer required many layers of explanation. A rented machine had to be connected to Richard Crafts by records and witnesses. Its location had to be connected to the road sighting. Its possible use had to be connected to the type of fragments recovered. Its surfaces had to be examined for traces. You can see how the case built itself through links, and how each link needed its own proof. If one link was weak, the others had to be examined even more carefully. That is why chain of custody becomes more than a legal phrase here. It is the memory of the evidence. It tells us who found an item, who bagged it, who transported it, who opened it, who tested it, and where it rested between those moments. You can imagine initials written across evidence tape, dates placed beside signatures, and storage shelves arranged in a way that looks ordinary until you understand what they protect. The evidence had to be able to travel from riverbank to lab to courtroom without losing its integrity. In a case like Helle Crafts, chain of custody also protects the people involved. It protects the victim's memory from careless handling. It protects the accused from unreliable proof. It protects jurors from being asked to trust evidence that cannot be traced. You and I can sit with that broader meaning. Procedure may look dry on paper, but procedure is one way a serious system shows respect. It slows everyone down. It makes each hand accountable to the next. The fiber evidence also asked for slow explanation. Fibers are common, and that is both their weakness and their value. A single fiber rarely gives a complete answer, but a fiber found in the right place, matching the right material, during the right timeline, can become part of a larger pattern. You can picture blue strands lifted with care, placed on slides, and compared under magnification against known samples. The color would not be just blue. It would have shade, composition, twist, and structure. You may find, as you read, that trace evidence has a nearly quiet personality. It does not demand attention the way larger evidence does. It waits in seams, carpets, tools, clothing, and machinery. It moves when people move. It transfers through contact, sometimes innocently, and sometimes in ways that matter deeply. In the Helle Crafts case, trace evidence helped investigators describe connections that no one had intended to preserve. That is often what makes trace evidence so powerful. It is left behind without permission. Still, every trace had to be interpreted with caution. The presence of a fiber does not always mean one thing. The absence of a fiber does not always mean another. Investigators had to ask whether a fiber could have arrived through ordinary household contact, through later contamination, or through the specific acts the prosecution alleged. You and I can feel how careful that thinking must be. The goal was not to make every trace dramatic. The goal was to understand which traces belonged to the meaningful pattern. That pattern grew around Richard's behavior after Helle disappeared. His explanations, purchases, cleaning, and movements were all examined in relation to the physical evidence. You can imagine investigators comparing receipts to dates, checking statements against witness accounts, and returning to the timeline when a new detail arrived. A timeline in such a case is almost like a quiet shoreline. Every fact washes up against it, and if the timing does not fit, the investigator notices. The timing of the woodchipper rental was especially important. It did not sit months away from Helle's disappearance, where coincidence might have felt easier. It sat close enough to demand explanation. You can picture the rental form as a plain piece of paper, perhaps creased at the edge, bearing practical details that became deeply serious later. Machines are rented for normal reasons every day, but normal reasons have their own supporting facts, and investigators had to decide whether Richard's explanation had those supports. The snowplow driver's memory helped give the rental a road and a landscape. Without him, the machine might have remained a document and an object. With him, it became part of a night near Lake Zoar. You and I can return to that cab again. The engine vibration, the smell of wet work clothes, the scrape of a plow blade, the glow of headlights on roadside equipment. He did not know, in that moment, that memory was being made. He only noticed what a working person notices. Later, when asked, that noticed thing became testimony. Testimony is a strange transformation. A passing sight becomes a formal statement. A memory enters a transcript. A person who once drove through winter darkness sits under courtroom light and answers questions about what he saw. You can imagine the effort to be precise, the humility of saying what he knew and not more. In the Helle Crafts case, that humility helped the testimony fit properly with the rest of the evidence. The Lake Zoar searches gave the testimony its physical counterpart. Searchers looked where the memory pointed. They recovered what the ground and water had kept. You can feel the quiet partnership between human memory and physical place. A witness says, "There." Investigators go there. The land answers only partially, but it answers enough to continue. This is one of the patient rhythms of detective work. Ask, go, look, collect, test, and then ask again. As you sit with the file, the map of the case becomes more textured. Newtown is not just the town where Helle lived. It is the place of the house, the family routines, the private strain before the disappearance. Southbury and Lake Zoar are not just names nearby. They are the cold landscape, where the strange evidence entered the natural world. The forensic laboratory is not just a destination for samples, it is where small things were given language. The courtroom is where that language had to be understood. Each place had its own sound. The house may have had the low hum of appliances and the muffled quiet of carpeting. The roadside had engines, water, wind, and the occasional hiss of tires on damp pavement. The lab had paper, glass, metal instruments, and ventilation. The courtroom had footsteps, chairs, whispers, and the steady tapping of a court reporter. You and I move through these sounds slowly because atmosphere is not decoration here. It helps us remember that evidence comes from real places. The Helle Crafts case also depended on people trusting unease before certainty arrived. Her friends were uneasy. Keith Mayo was uneasy. Investigators became uneasy as explanations failed. Unease is not proof, but it can be a compass when handled responsibly. You can imagine someone saying, quietly, "This does not sound like Helle." That sentence does not convict anyone, but it can keep a case alive long enough for the evidence to be found, and sometimes that is the difference between loss and recognition. Helle's own preparations for divorce gave that unease context. She had taken steps that showed intention, concern, and planning. She had reached beyond the household to seek help. You can picture papers gathered, appointments made, private conversations held in lowered voices. A person preparing to leave a marriage is often careful with details, because the future feels both necessary and uncertain. Those preparations made the idea of voluntary disappearance less convincing, especially when she left no ordinary trail of contact. Richard's explanations then had to be measured against a woman who was still engaged with her life. Helle had children. She had work. She had friends. She had family abroad. She had legal and personal reasons to remain visible. You and I can see why investigators did not accept a vague story of departure. To leave, as Richard suggested, she would have had to abandon too many threads at once, and those who knew her did not believe that matched her character. Character evidence can be complicated, and the law treats it carefully, but in missing person work, known habits matter. Does the person call home? Do they miss work? Do they travel without telling anyone? Do they leave children without contact? Do they disappear while preparing legal action? Investigators ask these questions because the pattern of a life helps define what counts as unusual. In the Helle Crafts case, the pattern of Helle's life made the silence louder. You can feel the silence in the unanswered phone. You can feel it in the absence of a letter from Denmark, the absence of a workplace explanation, the absence of a credible travel record. These are quiet absences, but they accumulate. A person's life is usually noisy with small confirmations. When all those confirmations stop, and the stopping aligns with suspicious behavior by someone close to her, the file begins to narrow. Not suddenly, but with the slow firmness of a door drawing nearly shut. The prosecution later relied on that narrowing. It had to show that Helle was not simply missing, and that Richard was responsible. The strange evidence helped answer the first part, while the timeline and conduct helped answer the second. You and I can follow that legal architecture without turning it into a lecture. It is enough to see how one question rests on another. Is Helle dead? If so, how do we know? If we know, who caused it? If Richard? What facts prove that beyond reasonable doubt? The answer came through interlocking evidence, and interlocking evidence has a special kind of quiet strength. Remove one piece, and the structure may still stand if the others are sound. Challenge one witness, and the records remain. Question one trace, and the timeline still speaks. That does not mean every case built this way is strong, but this one became strong through the number and fit of its parts. You can picture the evidence like stones placed carefully across a stream, each one helping the next step become possible. In the first trial, the jury could not cross the stream together. Some jurors were not convinced, or not convinced enough, and the law required agreement. That mistrial reminds us that difficult proof does not become easy because investigators believe in it. You can imagine the strain of that moment, the quiet disappointment in the courthouse, the sense that everyone would have to begin again. For Helle's loved ones, the waiting lengthened. For prosecutors, the case returned to their desks. The second trial refined the crossing. The evidence was presented again, more clearly, with lessons learned from the first attempt. You can imagine the prosecution smoothing the order of witnesses, clarifying expert explanations, and making sure jurors understood how the small pieces related to the larger pattern. Nothing about that work is glamorous. It is patient revision. It is the courtroom version of returning to a search area and looking again because something important may still be there. When the second jury convicted Richard Crafts, the legal system accepted the structure built from those pieces. Yet, the conviction did not end the meaning of the evidence. It sent the case into legal memory, where it would be studied as an example of proof without a complete body. You and I can see why. The case sat at the intersection of forensic science, circumstantial evidence, witness memory, and patient courtroom explanation. It showed how a truth could be assembled from what remained. But if we stay too long with the legal lesson, we risk missing the emotional weight of the assembly. Every piece recovered meant that someone had searched a place connected to Helle's disappearance. Every comparison meant that someone had handled material tied to her absence. Every courtroom exhibit meant that her family had to hear the case translated into public terms. The evidence solved the legal question, but it also carried grief through official channels. That is a heavy task for small things. You turn another page, and the file brings us back to the experts who had to make the small things understandable. Expert testimony in the Helle Crafts case had to move at a human pace. Too much technical language, and the jury might lose the thread. Too little technical language, and the science might seem unsupported. You can picture an expert choosing words carefully, explaining bone structure, dental comparison, or fiber characteristics in plain terms while still honoring the complexity. The courtroom listens differently from the laboratory. In court, a finding must be not only accurate, but understandable. Dr. Henry Lee's explanations helped bridge that distance. He became known for making forensic evidence visible to lay people, and this case gave him material that required exactly that skill. You can imagine him describing how traces were collected, what they looked like, and how they connected to the machine or search area. The point was not to dazzle, it was to make the physical world legible. You and I can appreciate how important that is when the physical world has been reduced to tiny, difficult fragments. The dental expert had a similar bridge to build. Dental identification can seem mysterious until it is explained as a comparison between known records and recovered material. Teeth and dental work are highly individual, not in a magical way, but through the practical accumulation of care, repair, and anatomy. You can picture jurors being guided through that comparison slowly, shown why certain features mattered, and invited to understand the conclusion. The process asks for attention, not blind faith. Fiber experts also had to speak carefully. They could not say more than the fibers allowed. They could say that a fiber matched or was consistent with a source in color, type, and structure. They could explain how fibers transfer and why location matters. You and I notice the modesty of that language. Modesty is not weakness. In forensic testimony, it is often the mark of reliability. The expert who stays within limits helps the jury trust the conclusion that is actually supported. Blood evidence, where present, also belonged to the older forensic era of the case. Before modern DNA became a common courtroom expectation, investigators relied on testing that could classify and compare in more limited ways. You can imagine how different that feels from the present. Today, people expect tiny samples to yield names. In 1986, and the years that followed, the science asked for more cautious interpretation. The Helle Crafts case had to be proved with the tools available then, not the tools we now imagine. That historical setting matters. It means the case was not simple even with forensic help. The scientists worked hard, but within narrower channels. The prosecution could not lean on a full modern genetic profile to resolve every dispute. Instead, it had to combine forms of evidence: biological, dental, trace, mechanical, documentary, and behavioral. You and I can feel the patience required by that combination. It is slower than a single test result, but perhaps more revealing of investigative craft. The equipment evidence required its own practical expertise. A wood chipper has moving parts, blades, surfaces, and internal areas where material might lodge. Examining it means understanding how the machine works. It means checking places a casual observer might not think to check. You can smell the machine oil, feel the cold metal, and hear the muted clank of tools as panels are opened or surfaces inspected. A machine can be a difficult witness, but it can retain what a person meant to remove. Investigators also considered tools associated with the household or Richard's actions, including a chainsaw that entered the evidence. As with the wood chipper, the key was not the object alone, but traces, timing, and context. You can picture the tool resting on evidence paper, its shape familiar and unsettling at once, while examiners looked for materials that might connect it to the larger case. A tool can be common. The question is whether this tool, in this time, in this person's possession, carries relevant traces. Household evidence can feel intimate in a different way. Bedding, carpets, floors, appliances, and cleaning patterns all belong to daily life. When they become evidence, they carry the discomfort of private rooms made public. You and I enter those rooms carefully. We notice what investigators noticed, but we do not linger for effect. The important thing is that ordinary domestic surfaces can hold evidence after someone has tried to make them ordinary again. Sometimes the attempt to restore normal appearance becomes part of what stands out. Cleaning is especially complicated. People clean homes constantly for innocent reasons, but sudden cleaning around a disappearance combined with other suspicious facts becomes worthy of attention. Investigators must ask what was cleaned, when with what, and whether traces remain despite the effort. You can picture a swab moving across a surface, a photograph taken before an item is moved, a note written in measured language. The work is almost quiet enough to disappear, but the result can matter deeply. The Helle Crafts case asked jurors to understand that no single household detail proved everything. A cleaned surface alone is not enough. A missing item alone is not enough. A rented machine alone is not enough. But placed together, they formed a pattern of concealment. You and I can sit with that distinction because it is central to fair judgment. The power of the case was cumulative, and cumulative evidence must be followed patiently from beginning to end. That is perhaps why the case fits so well into this quiet study of detective work. It does not offer the satisfaction of one bright clue. It offers the steadier satisfaction of many people refusing to overlook what seems small. A friend's worry, a private investigator's concern, a driver's memory, a rental document, a fragment in damp leaves, a dental chart in an office, a lab report written in careful sentences. The case moves through these things like a slow hand turning pages. As we continue, the pages lead us back to Helle's life before the file, because understanding the evidence also means understanding what was interrupted. Helle came to the United States from Denmark, and her life carried the sense of someone who had crossed distances before. You can imagine the soft differences of accent, the memories of another country, the letters or calls to family abroad, and the life she built in Connecticut through work and marriage. She was not only a local missing person, she belonged to more than one place. That made Richard's claim that she had gone away seem, at first glance, like something investigators had to check seriously. And they did check it. They looked for signs that she had gone to Denmark or elsewhere. They considered whether travel had occurred, whether family had heard from her, whether records supported the story. You and I can picture the practical work of those checks, the phone calls, the time zones, the airline systems, the quiet waiting for confirmation that did not come. A false explanation often borrows from truth. Helle did have ties abroad. That made the claim possible enough to investigate, but not strong enough to survive. Her work as a flight attendant also complicated the surface impression. A person who flies for a living can seem mobile, less fixed than someone whose work stays in one town. But mobility still leaves structure. Flight attendants have schedules, colleagues, assignments, records, and professional obligations. Helle did not simply float between places without trace. Her work created another set of expectations, and when those expectations were broken, the break was visible. You can feel how investigators used the order of her life to challenge disorderly explanations. Colleagues likely knew her routines in ways that mattered. Workplaces become communities of observation, especially in jobs built around timing and reliability. A missed assignment, an unexplained absence, a failure to communicate. These things show. You can imagine uniforms in closets, luggage stored nearby, the faint scent of travel on clothing, and the mental calendar of flights ahead. Helle's working life had momentum. Her disappearance stopped that momentum without the ordinary signs of a chosen departure. Her role as a mother made the disappearance still less believable as voluntary. We handle that with care, because motherhood should never be used as a simplistic measure of a person's choices. But in this case, those who knew Helle did not believe she would abandon her children without contact. The file holds that conviction in various forms. You can imagine friends saying it quietly, not as a slogan, but from knowledge of her. She was connected to them. She would not have let them wonder if she could have helped it. That human knowledge supported the investigation's practical findings. No credible trail showed Helle living elsewhere. No reliable contact reassured family or friends. No normal pattern of travel explained the silence. You and I can feel the absence closing in as the pages turn. It is not a dramatic darkness. It is more like a room where lights are turned off one by one until only the evidence remains lit on the desk. The divorce context added motive, but motive alone is never enough. Many marriages end painfully without crime. Many people argue, separate, and rebuild. Investigators had to be careful not to let a troubled marriage become an automatic answer. In the Helle Crafts case, motive mattered because it aligned with opportunity, suspicious conduct, physical evidence, and false or weak explanations. You can see the difference. The marriage trouble opened a question. The evidence answered it. Keith Mayo's role becomes clearer in that context. Helle did not hire him casually. She sought help because she was gathering information and preparing for legal change. You can picture his office, perhaps modest, with files stacked near a phone, notes written during surveillance or conversation, and the practical atmosphere of someone paid to notice details. His involvement before the disappearance gave investigators a rare kind of pre-event documentation. It showed Helle's concerns were not invented afterward. Mayo also became one of the people who recognized the urgency of her absence. That matters because early delay can damage a case. Evidence can be cleaned, moved, weathered, forgotten, or lost. People can settle into false explanations if no one challenges them. You and I can appreciate the value of someone calling attention quickly, especially when the missing person's own voice has been silenced. In this case, concern did not remain private. It moved outward into action. The friends who spoke up did something similar. They moved concern from kitchens and phone calls into the official record. That can be difficult. Speaking to investigators about someone's marriage, fears, and private words may feel like a betrayal of privacy, even when it is necessary. You can imagine the discomfort in their voices, the wish that Helle could speak for herself, the care with which they tried to remember accurately. Their testimony became a way of standing beside her when she could not stand in court. This is one reason old case files feel so intimate. They preserve people at moments when they were trying to help under painful circumstances. A witness statement is not just information. It is also evidence of care, confusion, memory, and responsibility. You and I read those statements with quiet respect. We do not treat them as puzzle pieces only. They were spoken by people who had to carry the case in their own lives long after the legal pages were filed away. The investigators, too, carried it. Some cases stay with detectives because of the victim, or the method, or the difficulty, or the way the evidence nearly slipped away. The Helle Crafts case likely stayed with many who touched it. You can picture an investigator years later remembering the cold search area, the machine, the lab reports, and the long courtroom process. Patient work leaves marks on the people who do it. It is not only the file that holds the case. When the next layer opens, we can see how the prosecution transformed that lived investigative work into a narrative jurors could follow without losing the science. A trial narrative has to be faithful to evidence, but it also has to guide attention. Jurors hear many facts, and facts without order can become noise. In the Helle Crafts case, the prosecution needed to begin with Helle's life and disappearance, then lead the jury through Richard's statements, the rental, the road sighting, the searches, the forensic findings, and the meaning of all those things together. You can imagine the opening statement shaped like a path through a quiet but difficult landscape. The defense, meanwhile, had to interrupt that path. It had to suggest alternate meanings, point out gaps, and remind jurors that the state carried the burden. This is the rhythm of trial. One side builds, the other tests. The judge instructs. The jury listens. You and I can feel how slow that process must have been, especially in a case where so much evidence required explanation. The courtroom becomes a place where patience is not a mood, but a requirement. Photographs likely helped jurors understand places and objects. A photograph freezes a machine, a roadside, a room, or a fragment, but it also removes smell, temperature, and sound. You can picture jurors leaning forward slightly as an exhibit is shown, trying to translate a flat image back into a real place. The prosecution's task was to restore context. This was the road. This was the machine. This was where material was recovered. This was how it connected to the rest. Maps served a similar purpose. A juror may not know Newtown, Southbury, or Lake Zoar. A map turns unfamiliar names into distances and routes. You can imagine a pointer moving slowly along a line, showing where the craft's home was, where the equipment was rented, where the witness saw the machine, and where searchers found evidence. Geography becomes argument, but only if it is shown plainly. The jury must be allowed to see the route without being pushed faster than the facts allow. The expert exhibits were different. They may have involved diagrams, enlarged photographs, charts, or comparisons. A tiny fiber becomes visible when enlarged. A dental feature becomes understandable when marked. A machine part becomes meaningful when its function is explained. You and I can see how enlargement can help without changing the fact that the original evidence was small. The courtroom had to look closely, just as the investigators had looked closely before. Looking closely can be tiring. That is true for jurors, investigators, and listeners. So the case had to be repeated in clear, steady ways. Not dramatic repetition, but helpful return. The rental record mattered because of timing. The witness mattered because of location. The fragments mattered because of identity and process. The household evidence mattered because of concealment. Each time the prosecution returned to these ideas, the pattern became easier to hold. You can feel the structure settling into place. The first jury did not settle fully into agreement, and that remains an important part of the story. It reminds us that no matter how strong a case later appears, the process was not effortless. Some doubts survived the first presentation. Perhaps certain evidence was not explained clearly enough. Perhaps the absence of a complete body weighed heavily. Perhaps jurors differed in how they understood scientific testimony. We do not need to know every deliberation to respect the difficulty. The retrial required resilience from everyone seeking accountability. Witnesses had to return. Experts had to testify again. Helle's family and friends had to endure the evidence again. Prosecutors had to refine without distorting. Investigators had to trust the work they had already done, while learning from what had not persuaded before. You can imagine the emotional fatigue of that repetition. The same words spoken again can feel heavier the second time, because hope has already been strained once. Yet the second trial reached a verdict. The conviction marked a legal recognition that the small pieces together were enough. You and I let that fact sit softly. Enough does not mean complete. Enough does not mean painless. Enough means the law found that the proof crossed the required threshold. In a nobody case, that threshold can feel especially solemn, because the jury must rely on the patient accumulation of evidence rather than the visual certainty people often expect. The phrase, "nobody case" itself is imperfect here, and we should be precise. Helle's complete body was not recovered, but human remains and identifying evidence were part of the prosecution's proof. The phrase refers to the absence of a full recovered body in the traditional sense. That distinction matters because it honors what the investigators did find. The case was not built on pure absence, it was built on traces, and the traces were real. Those traces made the Helle Crafts case different from cases where a person vanishes and no physical evidence ever emerges. Here, the physical world gave partial answers. A fragment near Lake Zoar, material connected through forensic work, evidence linked to tools and household spaces. The answers were incomplete, but they were not silent. You can feel how investigators had to learn to listen to partial answers, because partial answers were all the case would give. That is one of the deep lessons of patient detective work. You rarely receive the whole truth in one piece. You receive what the world still holds. The rest must be inferred carefully, lawfully, and with humility. In the Helle Crafts case, the world held enough. Records, traces, witnesses, scientific comparisons, and behavior that could be weighed. You and I sit with that enoughness, not as comfort exactly, but as recognition of work done well under difficult conditions. From here, the file leads outward again, into how this case influenced later investigators who faced disappearances without complete remains. When later detectives study the Helle Crafts case, they may see permission to keep going in cases that look impossible at first. A body may not be recovered in the expected way. A suspect may offer plausible-sounding explanations. Evidence may be scattered, damaged, or strange. Yet the case teaches that patient collection can still matter. You can picture a cold case detective years later, sitting in a small office with a faded file, thinking of how small traces solved other large questions. The case also teaches caution. It does not say that every strange trace proves a theory. It says that traces must be gathered properly, tested honestly, and placed in context. The difference is essential. You and I can feel that difference as a kind of moral center in the work. The investigator must want the truth more than a theory. The scientist must want accuracy more than certainty. The prosecutor must want justice more than a clean story. That ethic is why the Helle Crafts case remains useful beyond its shocking surface. If it were only strange, it would be remembered as a curiosity. It remains important because the strange evidence was handled through serious method. The wood chipper was not a headline only. It was an object examined, connected, challenged, and explained. The fragments were not symbols only. They were material evidence, processed through forensic discipline. The case survived because the method held. Method is calming in a difficult story. It gives us a way to move through sadness without being swallowed by it. You take the next page. You read the next report. You compare the next date. You listen to the next witness. The work does not erase the loss, but it gives care a form. In the Helle Crafts case, care took the form of searches, lab work, trial preparation, and testimony. That form is what carried Helle's name through the system. The public often remembers cases through the most unusual detail, but investigators remember labor. They remember who stood in the rain, who found the record, who stayed late, who noticed an inconsistency, who prepared the chart, who answered cross-examination calmly. You and I are closer to the investigators tonight. We are sitting with the labor. The strange evidence is still here, but it is quieter now, surrounded by all the patient effort that made it meaningful. If you imagine the case file as a physical object, it is thick by now. Statements, photographs, lab reports, maps, rental forms, court transcripts, notes, appeals, articles. The pages do not all feel the same. Some are crisp with typed findings. Some are softened by handling. Some carry the emotional weight of witness recollection. You can almost feel the slight resistance as a metal binder ring turns, the paper settling after each page. This is how a case becomes both history and record. But inside that record, certain moments remain especially vivid. The friend hearing Helle's fear. Keith Mayo recognizing that her disappearance did not fit. The snowplow driver seeing equipment near Lake Zoar. Searchers finding small material in a cold landscape. Scientists identifying what others might have missed. Jurors listening through difficulty. These moments are not loud, but they remain lit, like small lamps spaced along a long hallway. We can walk that hallway slowly, returning to each lamp without hurry. At the first lamp is Helle's life, full and ordinary before the case. At the second is concern, the human recognition that something was wrong. At the third is the rental record, a practical document with serious implications. At the fourth is the witness sighting near cold water. At the fifth is the laboratory, where fragments were studied with care. At the sixth is the courtroom, where all of it had to be spoken aloud. Even this image, gentle as it is, should not become too neat. Real cases are messier than hallways. They include confusion, delay, disagreement, and uncertainty. The Helle Crafts case included a mistrial before conviction. It included evidence that had to be defended against serious challenge. It included the absence of a complete body, which made every conclusion more difficult. You and I can respect that messiness while still following the order that later review provides. The legal appeals and later public discussions did not erase the conviction. They became part of the record's afterlife. Cases of this importance often continue to be cited, debated, and taught. That does not mean the central facts become unstable. It means the case continues to have meaning in law and forensic practice. You can imagine law students reading about it, perhaps underlining phrases about circumstantial evidence, nobody prosecutions, and expert testimony. The file keeps speaking in new rooms. For Helle's loved ones, though, the case's educational value likely sat far behind the personal loss. That is another distinction we keep clear. A case can teach the world and still remain a wound for those closest to it. You can picture a family member hearing the case referenced in a class or article and feeling both recognition and distance. Public memory often belongs to everyone, but grief remains particular. The name in the textbook was someone's mother, friend, colleague, and daughter. That awareness brings us back to the tone of the investigation. Patient detective work is not cold work, even when it is technical. It is often driven by care, duty, and the refusal to let a person be reduced to absence. In the Helle Crafts case, that refusal took practical form. People searched where it was cold. They handled evidence that was difficult. They testified under pressure. They returned for a second trial. They made the strange evidence speak clearly enough for the law to hear. The small pieces then were not only scientific artifacts. They were the remaining points of contact between Helle and the world that tried to understand what happened to her. That thought is solemn, and we hold it gently. A dental record connected to a recovered item. A fiber connected one place to another. A machine retained what someone had tried to remove. A witness carried a memory from a winter road. These things formed a bridge over a silence Richard's explanations could not fill. As the file rests open in front of us, we can turn back toward the household timeline, because the ordinary rooms of the Crafts' home still hold questions that shaped the investigation. The home is where investigators had to look for the first signs that the official explanation did not match the physical setting. You can imagine the front door, the interior air, the surfaces that seemed normal until examined, and the soft hush that comes when a house becomes a scene. The Helle Crafts case moved outward to Lake Zoar and the lab, but it began in the space where Helle had lived. That space mattered because it held the first material contradictions. A house has habits. Shoes gather near certain doors. Children's items settle in familiar places. Bedding, towels, papers, and luggage all follow patterns shaped by the people who live there. When those patterns change abruptly, investigators notice. You and I can picture a detective standing still for a moment, not touching anything yet, simply letting the room show what it can. The smell of cleaning product may be faint. A surface may look too recently wiped. An item may be missing from where it should be. Those impressions have to be converted into evidence. A detective cannot testify to a feeling alone. So the camera comes out. The notes begin. Items are marked. Surfaces are tested. Questions are asked of everyone who knew the household. Was this usually here? When was that replaced? Who bought this? Who moved that? You can hear the patience in those questions. They are not grand questions, but they can open a case from the inside. The freezer, bedding, and cleaning details entered this practical inquiry. Investigators considered whether objects had been used, moved, or discarded in ways that fit the larger timeline. You can imagine the cold feel of a freezer handle, the dry whisper of bedding folded or removed, the sharp scent of cleaner lingering beyond its usual place. None of these details alone could carry the whole case. Together, they suggested that something had been managed, hidden, or altered after Helle disappeared. Richard's knowledge of the home gave those details added significance. A stranger would not have had the same access, time, or ability to explain household changes. Richard did. That does not prove everything by itself, but it narrows the field. You and I can see how opportunity works in a domestic case. It is not only physical presence, it is control over the space, control over explanations, and control over the first story others are asked to believe. The first story matters because early explanations can shape how quickly people respond. If a husband says his wife has gone away, some listeners may hesitate before challenging him. Social trust can delay suspicion. A person close to the missing individual may be believed because closeness usually implies knowledge. In the Helle Crafts case, that early trust was tested by friends, Mayo, and investigators who compared Richard's words to Helle's known life. The comparison did not support him. You can feel how delicate that social moment is. To question a spouse's explanation is serious. To accept it too easily can be dangerous. Investigators often have to stand in that uncomfortable middle space, neither assuming guilt nor accepting convenience. They ask for records. They ask for contact information. They ask for proof of travel. They ask again when the answers are thin. The work is calm, but it is not passive. Helle's friends helped investigators occupy that middle space. They did not simply say they felt uneasy. They gave reasons rooted in Helle's words and actions. She had spoken of fear. She had hired Mayo. She had been preparing for divorce. She had children she loved and responsibilities she would not simply abandon. You and I can see how these reasons gave investigators permission, in a practical sense, to press harder against Richard's account. Concern became actionable because it was detailed. The search of the home and the search near Lake Soar were therefore connected by more than suspicion. They were connected by a timeline of post-disappearance behavior. What happened in the house may have led to what happened with the rented machine. What happened with the machine may have led to the roadside and riverbank evidence. What was found there returned to the lab and then back into the courtroom. The path is long, but when you trace it slowly, the direction becomes clear. Still, we should keep acknowledging the effort it took to trace that path. Investigators did not have the advantage of a full confession. They did not have a conventional recovery. They did not have modern DNA tools to simplify identification. They had to let older forensic methods, witness testimony, and circumstantial logic work together. That makes the case a patient one, even though it was solved within a few years rather than after decades. The patience lived in the complexity, not only in the calendar. The time from Helle's disappearance to Richard's conviction included searches, expert work, a first trial, a mistrial, and a second trial. For the people waiting, those years would not have felt brief. You can imagine seasons passing over the same Connecticut roads, leaves returning, then falling again, while the case moved through legal stages. Court dates replace search dates. Transcripts replace field notes. Yet the central question remains the same, steady and unresolved until the verdict. What happened to Helle, and can it be proved? That question carried everyone forward, and as we move with it, we can look more closely at how the verdict depended on the idea of proof beyond a reasonable doubt. Proof beyond a reasonable doubt does not mean proof beyond every imagined possibility. It means proof strong enough that reasonable doubt does not remain after the evidence is considered. In the Helle Crafts case, that standard had to be met without a complete recovered body. and that gave the jury a difficult responsibility. You can picture the judge's instructions being read in a measured tone, each legal phrase settling into the quiet room before jurors were sent to deliberate. The jurors then had to bring together science and common sense. They had to ask whether Helle's absence could be voluntary. They had to ask whether the recovered evidence showed death. They had to ask whether Richard's conduct fit innocence or concealment. They had to consider expert testimony, witness credibility, and defense challenges. You and I can imagine the deliberation room, the scrape of chairs, the papers spread out, the long pauses between comments. Deciding slowly is part of deciding seriously. In that room, the weird evidence would have been discussed in practical terms. What did the dental evidence show? What did the bone evidence show? What did the machine evidence show? What did the snowplow driver see? How did the rental timing fit? What did the household traces suggest? The jurors did not need to become scientists. They needed to decide whether the scientists and other witnesses had given them reliable reasons to accept the state's account. The final verdict meant they had. It meant the evidence had crossed the line from suspicion to legal proof. But even in that moment, the file did not become simple. The case remained a sorrowful one, with a fragmented recovery and a family left without the full presence of the person they lost. You and I can let the conviction be what it was, a serious legal answer, without asking it to become emotional completion. The law can decide responsibility. It cannot restore the ordinary morning. The ordinary morning is what Helle was denied, and that thought returns quietly whenever we focus too much on the unusual mechanics of the case. She should have had more flights, more phone calls, more birthdays, more small domestic choices, more chances to shape her own future. The evidence matters because it resisted the erasure of those possibilities. It said, in its small and difficult way, that her disappearance was not a choice she had made. That is why the patient work mattered. As we continue, the case file becomes less a puzzle and more a record of persistence, and that persistence has its own atmosphere. You can imagine the evidence room after the trial, quieter than before, boxes returned to shelves, labels checked once more. Some items retained for appeals and future reference. The fluorescent lights hum over metal racks, and the air smells faintly of cardboard, dust, and sealed plastic. A case may be legally resolved, but evidence does not simply vanish. It remains, because the system knows that records may be needed again, and because serious cases leave long shadows. The transcripts also remain. Testimony becomes typed lines, page after page, preserving voices in a flattened but durable form. You can almost feel the thin paper, the black ink, the margins where attorneys might place notes. A spoken hesitation becomes a comma. A technical explanation becomes paragraphs. A witness's memory becomes a numbered page. In the Helle Crafts case, those transcripts helped carry the case beyond the courtroom into legal and forensic study. Reading a transcript is different from hearing testimony. You lose the room's temperature, the witness's voice, the way jurors shifted in their seats. But you gain the ability to slow down. You can reread a question, you can compare an answer to another page, you can notice how an expert limited a conclusion or how a defense attorney tested a point. You and I are doing a version of that now, turning the case into a slow listening rather than a rush toward outcome. That slow listening reveals how many disciplines met in the case: forensic pathology, odontology, trace analysis, tool examination, criminal investigation, domestic violence context, courtroom advocacy, and jury reasoning all touched the file. No single discipline owned the truth. Each contributed a part. The Helle Crafts case is therefore not only about weird evidence, it is about coordination. The way different kinds of knowledge can gather around one question without losing their separate rules. Coordination requires trust, but not blind trust. Detectives trust scientists to test. Scientists trust collectors to preserve. Prosecutors trust both to explain. Jurors trust the court process to let them hear challenges as well as claims. At each stage, trust is supported by documentation. You can see why paper matters so much in this story. The file is not just storage, It is the visible form of trust being checked, signed, dated, and carried forward. This is one reason the old case file atmosphere feels so fitting. The manila folders, the typed reports, the photographs with their slightly faded colors, the maps marked by hand, the evidence tags with initials. All of it belongs to a slower investigative world. Not a better world, necessarily, but a world where patience had to be built into the process because fewer shortcuts existed. In the Helle Crafts case, that slower world still found its way to proof. Modern investigators might approach parts of the case differently now. DNA testing, digital records, surveillance systems, cell phone data, and improved databases might change the speed and shape of the work. But those tools would still need the same basic discipline. You and I can recognize that technology changes, while attention remains central. Someone must still notice the odd record, preserve the trace, question the weak explanation, and place the facts in order. The case also reminds us that evidence can be both fragile and stubborn. Fragile because weather, cleaning, machinery, and time can damage it. Stubborn because traces remain in unexpected places. A fiber clings. A record stays filed. A witness remembers. A dental chart waits. A machine holds residue in a seam. You can feel the quiet tension between disappearance and persistence. Richard's apparent effort, as proved in court, was to remove evidence. The world persisted anyway. That persistence is not magical. It is material. Paper, metal, enamel, fiber, bone, mud, memory. Each has limits. Each can fail. But sometimes they hold enough. The Helle Crafts case became famous because enough remained, and because investigators recognized enough when they saw it. You and I can sit with that phrase, enough remained, and feel the solemn patience inside it. Not everything. Not the full answer in every detail, but enough for truth to be established in law. And the file, still open in front of us tonight, invites us to keep moving through those remaining details, not for shock, but for the quiet understanding of how carefully they were gathered. By the time the courtroom had finished its work, the Helle Crafts case had been solved in law, though not in any way that could make the loss feel whole. Richard Crafts was convicted of Helle's murder in 1989, after an earlier trial had ended without agreement, and he was sentenced to serve 50 years in prison. He later left prison in 2020 under sentence credit rules that applied to his case. But the conviction remained the legal answer. Helle's complete body was never recovered, and that absence stays in the file like a quiet space no verdict can fill. So we leave the evidence where it belongs now, resting in the long record of a case that asked people to notice what was small. A fragment in cold ground, a witness's memory from a winter road, a dental chart kept for ordinary care, a machine examined with patience. You can feel the old paper settling beneath your hand, and the room around you becoming still again. There is no need to make the case louder than it was. The work was careful enough. The people who searched, tested, remembered, and testified gave Helle Crafts the dignity of being believed, and gave the law enough to speak her name clearly. That is the quiet center of it, after all the strange evidence has been placed back into its folders. The questions that remain are not the kind a courtroom can fully answer. They belong to family, memory, and the private shape of grief. For tonight, you can let the file close softly, with the lamp still warm beside you, and the last page resting flat in the dark.